Greetings, programs, and welcome back to a new episode of the Awesome Friday podcast. I am your host, Matthew, and joining me today, as is what usually happens, is Simon. Say hello to our people, Simon.
Good morning to the people of the British Republic of Canada and to our responsibility nations all over the world. I do hope you're enjoying our new king. We certainly are.
Point of order: we are the Dominion of Canada, not the Republic.
Yes, that's right. You are in our Dominion, and that means that your money's going to change because we are now. The Magic Family has a new head, and that Magic Family from the other side of the world now is going to be on your money. And so you should be grateful, like
I really
grateful.
I really think that Charles was coronated as reporting yesterday. I really think he should have chosen a new regnal name. I think he should have been Chuck, King Chuck first.
King Kentucky, or
Yeah.
something like Lysander the Great, or Charles the Resurgitator, like something awesome.
Yeah, Charles the short-lived. Charles.
Well, let's hope so.
Charles the ears.
Someone said on Twitter yesterday, like, everyone's saying this is a once in a lifetime occasion. Bitch, there's 3 of these lined up within my lifetime. Like, 2 of them were there, ready to take the stand. Like, William and his little boy were just like, yes.
Yeah.
It was
definitely a whole thing, right? I did not watch it. I did not say the words.
I don't think
as a person who I think I'm a little in the middle, because I think most of the people I know either are like fuck the monarchy or abolish the monarchy, and my personal position is like they don't actually have any bearing on my day-to-day life in Canada. Like they're figurehead only, so I don't care. But and it's different in the UK, obviously, because you're subsidizing this billionaire family, and I'm sure we are to some extent too. But like, we don't like we have a governor general, so that does all the assent in the name of the king, and the king doesn't actually have to do anything here. Like, it doesn't, and like the ruling party, the company, like the party that forms government in Canada, appoints the governor general. So like, it doesn't really affect me.
It's very interesting to me in that there are currently more food banks in the UK than McDonald's. There are tens of thousands of people who are eating one meal a day.
The UK is fucked.
People cannot afford to live at the moment. And so I was wondering, will this be reflected? Will it be a slightly more austere service? And then
No.
Golden Coach turned up, and he's like, at one point he wears 3 like ancient gold cloaks that are £3 of gold each. Then he has a gold scepter and a gold stick and a gold crown. And I'm like, there's going to be a point where people kind of get a bit French about this. Like, people, how hungry and poor are the poor going to get before they watch something like this and still think it's a good thing? I'm really interested in the Japan model. So I don't remember exactly what it was. My students told me, but the emperor in Japan used to be this almost like a monarchy we have here, subsidized huge amounts of money, and then that got changed completely. And the Japanese, the emperor, is now a kindly old man that people genuinely like, but is nothing more than a symbol, a tourism symbol, and doesn't get the money anymore, doesn't wield the power, doesn't wield the wealth, walks around the seats. And I was thinking, wouldn't it have been awesome if Charles had recognized the current state of our country, or of the country, and said, you know what, come line up. I'm going to ride down Pall Mall on a horse in a suit. I'm going to walk in. We're not going to sit here for 4 hours. You just give me the crown and say the words, and I'll say the words, and then we'll be done. Because that would be a better reflection of where we are. But of course, the country is still has this generational split where the old white conservatives want to have this monarch in place because it represents this very old-fashioned kind of power, doesn't it? But I mean, saying that, it was. We watched the whole thing. We watched the highlights in the morning. We had some people over, and then we watched it 3.5 hours of the whole thing, and it really felt like someone was cosplaying a Western RPG because the Kate. I don't know if you saw Kate Middleton, but I would go to war for that woman. She was wearing Britannia robes that looked like the kind of armor I wanted in Dragon's Dogma, with this amazing like headdress, and she was wearing Diana's earrings. And I would follow that woman into battle. Um, she looked incredible. So that was fun, and I'm really fascinated by the service, which has so many layers of like weird ritual, really weird ritual. That all these, it's a bit like if you strip back paint on an old house, you find all these layers of paint that people just painted over. So there's all these layers of ritual, and then at one point he has to go behind a screen because he gets anointed by oil, and that's actually too holy for anyone to actually see.
Yep.
But when they do it on Camilla, that's fine. You don't need the screens because it's just Camilla. Um, it's fascinating to me, but I don't think
Now, she's actually the
that
queen now, isn't she?
she is actually the queen. She was the queen consort, and then Charles, as king, changed his mother's wish and made her queen.
Yeah.
And I'm
I
just
mean,
gonna
I've watched
send
The
you.
Crown, so let me just say that that makes sense.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know functionally what the special family really can have a place in modern society, but it's interesting to me. But I'm no royalist. I'm having a conversation with my parents this morning. Me and my dad are exactly the same, and my wife and my mum are exactly the same. Like they love the whole nature of it, and they like the tradition of it. And me and my dad are like, burn the whole thing down, ransack the place, sell off the
Yeah.
gold.
Well, I
Um,
didn't watch it, but I did hear that they did crown Camilla without the stolen diamond in the crown, so that's something.
oh, okay.
Um, like they took the Kohinoor diamond out of the crown because
Fun.
again, stolen diamond. I mean, it's all stolen. We could have a whole podcast
Oh,
about imperialism, but it's a whole.
I mean, is it stolen or is it preserved for future
It's
generations?
stolen.
Why? Okay, but is it? Is It's like a museum. Consider the monarchy a museum. Consider the empire a museum. But the people that are
It's all
being on
stolen,
show
Simon.
didn't really show. They didn't really choose to be in the museum, if you like. It
It's
was
all
more like.
stolen. I can't even make a joke about it, man. It's all stolen. And
uh,
every time I hear someone being like, "Well, if we gave it back to them, they'd probably just ruin it," and I'm like, "Oh, you're
yes,
racist. Then you're just racist. Got it."
that's right.
Like,
That's right.
it's just to stop. Don't. It's anyway. Yeah, this is a different podcast. We're a movie podcast. But yes,
Yes,
imperialism is alive and well in certain aspects of society.
certain
Um, but
generation
it
for sure.
but
Hey,
it was a big TV event though, so that's I guess relevant. That's a good tie.
hey, I saw the Mario movie. We could talk about that for 10 seconds. That's a movie. I saw that on Tuesday. It
Oh yeah.
the reason that movie has made $1 billion is that it's exactly what you think it is. I'm kind of disappointed. It's fine. It's totally fine in that it's not terrible and it's not great. Like I'm the person who keeps saying you should talk about Illumination in the same breath as Pixar. Like Illumination are awesome, but this is the least Illumination movie because Nintendo are very, very protective with their IP. So it's fine. There's a couple of flashy moments. Jack Black's the MVP, and there's a star who sees the whole world as pain and death, and that's quite fun. But the rest is exactly, if you imagined a Super Mario Brothers movie and have played the games, then you can imagine this movie in its entirety.
Yeah, it's fine. I don't expect it to be anything more. I sort
Yeah.
of, without having seen it, I can say that I sort of get the critical reaction being not good, just because when you watch a ton of movies and you see the same thing over and over and over again, and they just show you the same thing again, kind of go, I wish they'd done anything
Hmm.
different at all. But and then I get
Yeah.
why the audience reaction is
Yeah.
actually quite high because it delivers on exactly what they promised
It
it's going to
does
deliver.
exactly.
So
It's a very safe movie, but it does it like it's laser guided and really well made. So it's not a bad movie. It's just not surprising in any way.
yeah, I saw a post from one of those on Facebook the other day, and it was from one of those Facebook pages that's very, very, very bait for nerds that says something inflammatory like this Star Wars character is better than that Star Wars character, or stuff that makes you want to make an angry comment, basically. um, and I didn't respond to it, but I started to, and I ended up just making a Facebook about it. So find me on Facebook. Public. But basically, I was like, because the post was like, critics are so out of touch, and it just highlighted the critic versus audience score on Mario movie, and also on another one that's had the same sort of divide. Can't remember what it was. But my point was like, don't use Rotten Tomatoes as a metric. It's just a measure of consensus. Like, use it as a tool
Mm.
to find critics whose tastes align with your own. You'll have a much better time.
Oh,
And then
you've been grown up.
like answering some of the more common, like, there's lots of commenters on these types of sites that are like, critics are all paid shills, and like, on, it's so. As a person who actually does work as a critic, because I am now in a position where I am getting paid to work as a critic. The idea that any of us outside of the like
Mm.
elite few could make a living at it is just
Mhm.
like, if you only knew how laughable it is. Like,
Mhm.
it's so far away from most people, and even those people who are the quote elite few, like the Matt Diller Seitzes and the Alan Sepinwalls of the world, like, those guys are constantly like writing books. One of them owns a bookstore. One of them has 3 different podcasts on 3 different, like, these people are still constantly having to hustle to make like an
Mhm.
actual living in this. Because for the same reason that the writers are all on strike, that like people don't value it the way they should. It's
Mhm.
criticism is an art form in and of itself, and people don't value it the way I. So what I'm coming a very long way to say is it's that.
Well, I mean, we can see that in the writers' strike as well, with the all the things that the writers have asked for, and Hollywood uh, Writers Association have said no, no, we're not going to pay you extra for residuals. We're not, and we're going to write things by AI, and then you have to fix them. And the writers are like,
Oh
well,
yeah,
what if we didn't do any of that? What if we valued creative expression for what it actually is, and not just something that anyone can do?
yeah. I mean, I honestly had thoughts about whether we should record this week, given that the writers' strike is on. To be clear, we're not in the guild, so
We
and
don't write. Yeah.
and also like, um, in case it's not clear, in case you haven't been following my Twitter, like we stand with the WGA on this issue. Like,
And
the
we're not
the
scripted.
the constant and ongoing erosion of writers' pay has been ridiculous, especially in the consistent and explosive increase in CEOs. Like,
Hmm.
the amount of money that David Zaslav made last, which is almost $250 million. Made $250
Hmm.
million last year. Um, um, would is enough to pay for the writers' demands, like, for decades.
That's
Like, and when the
insane.
writers went on strike, all of the combined, like, market cap value that the studios lost, because all of their stocks took a hit. They lost billions of dollars in value, and someone did the math and figured out they could fund all of the writers' demands for 30 years on just on the value lost from the strike happening.
Yeah, it's so
So,
pointless, isn't it?
and it's the same thing with the PSAC workers here in Canada, right? Like, just fucking pay them. Like, everyone, there's so many people in the world who are like, these people need to get back to work and process my tax return. And my answer is always like, oh, so their work has value, is what you're
Yeah,
saying? Like, so maybe pay them to do it. Like, these people are not compensated in today's, like, everyone needs to make more money. It's just a thing. Like,
yes.
and it's every time there's a major strike like this, and here in Canada we have 2 to follow, although I think PSAC is back to work all except for one division.
Hmm.
Um, or that's how it was last time I heard it, and the writers' strike. But every time there's one of these strikes, it just sort of reveals people as class traitors that you wouldn't expect, and it's really just. And then in some ways, it's also not surprising, because the number of blue checks on Twitter who are like, "Get them back to work." It's like, yep, that makes sense. It lock.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I know that's what
Anyway,
That's what many of them are for. Yeah. No, you're not wrong. Any of that.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. But anyway, Hollywood, if you're listening, like the reason you're able to pay David Zaslav $250 million a year is because of the writers. So pay them.
Do
Like
you know what I'm
it's not
do you know what I'm
complicated.
do you know what I'm really looking forward to, even though I haven't seen season one, and that's Rings of Power season two, because they've decided they're just going to carry on making that without writers, and I want to see a Lord of the Rings show without actual writers on it. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, and I think what a lot
Can
of
you
people don't
imagine?
realize, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that, lots of people think that you, as a writer, you write a script and you hand it in and then you're done. But that's just not the case. Like writers are on hand all the
Mm-hmm.
time. And every time there's some conversation either via like how the performance is shaking out or how the scene is working, like all those adjustments are happening by writers on set. Like writing doesn't finish until the show is finished shooting, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to many people need to realign how they understand the process to work as well. But also just like it's interesting because Amazon owns MGM Studios, which also owns James Bond, and it's like they don't remember
Oh,
Quantum of
Quantum.
Solace. And
Yeah.
like I'm pretty big. I think Quantum of Solace is not a bad movie. It's a very interesting movie. It really functions well as like a denouement to Casino Royale. Like it's very focused in a way that a lot of the other ones aren't, and it's also a direct sequel in a way that a lot of the other ones aren't. But also, you can definitely tell that they made that movie during a writer's strike
Yeah, for
because
sure.
a lot of it feels very drafty. A lot of it doesn't quite hang together very well, and the ending is quite abrupt. um, so even though I think it's an okay movie, not great but not terrible, it's lots of people think it's terrible though, and it's the reason for that is that there was a writer's strike in 2008. They weren't able to have writers on set. They weren't able to massage things as they went, and that's what we ended up with, right? And there's countless other examples from 2008. Lots of TV shows that were canceled or had short seasons or just never recovered their viewership from the year
Yeah.
when they had to go on hiatus. Like all the things we value about content, and I hate that I now have started calling it content. That's a whole discussion. But all of the things we value about the things we consume come from the writers. And
And that's the most
well,
annoying
not
thing for me.
not all of it, but like most of it. Like it starts with and
Yeah.
ends with the writer. So even in a way where we venerate directors in a way that I feel we probably should
Mm.
venerate writers, and I am definitely guilty of this, where
We
we talk in depth about a director's vision, but we don't talk about the script as much as we should.
Oh, we have
And
completely the wrong idea about directors. I had the wrong idea about directors until I worked on film sets and realized every movie you love, the reason you love it is because of the cinematographer and the
yeah,
writers. Like, you have directors are far too high up on the pedestal.
yeah,
But I think what you're saying is correct. And what I find the most frustrating is that the last writer strike, which I was working through, and it just brought everything to a crunch. And the result of the writer's strike was so clear that the importance that the writers bring to these productions is just kind of annoying. 15 years later, we're back in this position. And I've been
hmm
working in the creative arts since, well, God, all my life. And I've gone on and on and on about how creative output is so devalued, and it has been over years and years and years. It's underfunded, and there's this idea with like X Factor and all these shows where you can just be creative. You can just anyone can be a writer, anyone can be a singer, anyone can be a dancer, and it ignores the fact that professionals train. They learn how to do it, and they train for years and years and years to be good at it. There's no such thing as just being amazing at it. But with the writers, these studios think, well, anyone can write, right? You're just putting words on a paper. You're just putting words on the screen. And now with AI, it's like, well, we don't even need writers to do that anymore. We'll just generate it and fix it. And it's
yeah,
so frustrating because it so undervalues human creativity. And I worry where it's going from here.
yeah. And it's really upsetting that like the WGA released their negotiation like proposals and counters sheet. You can go find it. It's all over Twitter, but basically like about all of the biggest points, like don't use AI to write shows. Um, the proposal is don't from the WGA is like you can't use AI, and the response from the studios is refuse and no counter,
Yeah.
like no counter offer.
Of
And there's a
course, they
lot of
don't
them
want
like
that.
that. Like one of them is be transparent about streaming performance so that we can so writers can be compensated more fairly if their show's a huge hit. And the response is refuse, no counter offer. You know, like
Well,
it's
of
it's
course,
such
it's so clear that they want to make as much money as possible, and
yeah,
AI doesn't need residuals. AI doesn't even need to be paid more than just the license, and suddenly they've got scripts,
yeah.
and
And
and they can get an intern to punch them up, and it's
there's just so
very
many
very
stories
short
of
sighted.
there's also just so many stories of like writers who have a hit show on TV and are struggling to make rent. Or I read one from I can't remember who it was, but there was one on Twitter. If you look at my Twitter feed, you'll find it because I retweeted it. But it was from a writer talking about how in the same week they learned they were nominated for an Emmy, they had applied for and were rejected from a job at Best.
That's the bear writer.
Yeah, um, yeah, it's just so frustrating.
Yeah,
But anyway, we support the writers, and
we do.
you should too. And if you don't, remember, if you're not a CEO and you don't support the writers, then you are a class traitor, and that is you should think about that. You should think about. I think we often forget about what class we're actually in. I think most of us overestimate. And even if you
Mhm.
do like look at someone who's very successful as a writer, maybe has millions of dollars to their name, um, you still have more in common with that person than that person does with the CEO signing the checks.
Mhm.
Um,
True.
because the CEOs are all in a whole other class. So
Mhm.
anyway, that's very much
Should we
like
talk
the
about
movies we're about to
should we talk
watch.
about our movies?
Yeah, now that we've ranted for 20 minutes, we should probably move on. But so we're going to cover two
Uh-huh.
movies today, as we always do. And one of them, I guess, technically has some, you know, parallels in terms of like money and who it's allocated to. And so, Simon, why don't you give us a breakdown of the just released on demand uh, Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves?
Okay. Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves follows a band of adventurers trying to do a thing, and they do a thing, and they are misled in the objectives of what that thing would bring. And it turns out they give a very bad person a lot of power. In fact, a couple of people certain power, and then they spend the rest of the movie um, righting that wrong, and of course righting the wrongs in themselves as well, going through their character arcs. And basically, if you've ever watched the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon from the 80s, which is amazing and you should, if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons with a group of real life people, I really hope you have that opportunity because it's really really fun. If you liked good adventure movies from the 80s, if you like game night, um, then this movie is for you. I can't think of a single type of person that this movie I wouldn't recommend to watch this movie. It is one of those rare, almost old-fashioned ensemble adventures where every line is funny, or every joke is funny. The pathos is real. Everyone has an arc. The editing is spectacular. The directing is amazing. And this is so far away from the previous Dungeons and Dragons movie with Jeremy Irons chewing up the scenery. This is a very different kind of movie, and it really loves uh, the product of Dungeons and Dragons, and it gets what it is. But whoever wrote this really understands that Dungeons and Dragons isn't high fantasy. It's not Lord of the Rings. People don't walk around going, good morning to you. Or if they do, they're being sarcastic. It's often lots of sniping, lots of kind of quipping, and lots of big swings, like adventurers
Mm-hmm.
taking big, big swings and being really brave and surviving by the skin of their teeth, and then talking about it for like years afterwards. And Stranger Things actually got this I mean, the Duffer Brothers. We know that they've got a long connection with Dungeons and Dragons. Stranger Things got this too, and to the point that I was half expecting the end of this movie. Spoilers. I was half expecting it to be like the Lego Movie, where we pull back and we find it's actually the Stranger Things kids playing a D&D campaign in character. But the writers and directors get that Dungeons and Dragons is meant to be quippy, and uh, not everyone can be the hero, but everyone can be heroic,
Yeah.
and it's brilliantly done, and the cast is wonderful. Chris Pine continues to be uh, like this era's Jimmy Stewart. Like I think he's got the charm. He's got the he's funny. He's got
Guy.
great physical humor. He's handsome devil. Like he's got it all. And honestly, I feel a little bit bad because I've only seen Michelle Rodriguez be Michelle Rodriguez in every other movie she's been in, and this is probably my favorite performance of her in this movie. Like she's really good in this,
I
and
mean, but it does
um,
play to her strengths. Like she basically, she got her start in a boxing film, and she's in the Fast and Furious franchise, various action films. And
yes,
this one definitely still knows that, but it does. Her
well,
character does
it's a
have a
lot.
little more like humanity than a
Yeah,
lot of those other.
absolutely. Let's do actual proper acting. I love Justice Smith in everything he's in, so it's a real pleasure to see him in this. And I will pay money to watch Hugh Grant read from a newspaper. Like that, I will. In the current era of Hugh Grant is so perfect in anything he chooses to do is perfect, and he is perfect in this movie too.
Yeah.
And it's it's just very funny as well. There's the editors and directors understand the humor of unreliable narrators, uh, with flashbacks from those narrators that actually change as the narrator corrects themselves. It's a really tricky thing to get right, but this film does it brilliantly. Oh, I love this film so much.
Yeah, and it definitely buys into everything Dungeons and Dragons is in a big way too. In that, like, you definitely see Dragonborn, and I can't remember what the bird people are called. And they
So
mention
good.
like Neverwinter and Baldur's Gate, and like they very much like they're
Mm-hmm.
clearly Dungeons and Dragons fans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, this was written by Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly, along with Chris McKay and Michael Pagilio, um, who also they also wrote and directed Game Night, which you already mentioned, and they have a pretty great track record at this point um, of just making movies that are fun. Like Game Night is a super underrated movie. I feel like not enough people saw Game Night.
Mm-hmm.
Not enough people understand the hilarity that is the line. How could that possibly be profitable for Frito Lay? But this
I,
movie is also full of that kind of line, and it really understands that lots of
mm,
movies fail. Lots of movies like this one fail when they try to be like grim and brooding and super serious and
mm.
like the dragons are coming. You know, we must hunker down and be the heroes. And this movie is like, let's just pivot to Plan B. No, we're on Plan C, and Plan C is actually just Plan A again. Let's like it's very it captures the feeling of playing a Dungeons and Dragons game. You're right in that you said it would have been interesting if they, or would have been not a shock if it pulled back and just the Stranger Things kids playing a game. And what I was going to say before you said that was, I'm pretty sure the way they wrote this is they just played Dungeons and Dragons and recorded it did.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
um, and I think that I think you're right. It's really well cast. Chris Pine is, I think Chris Pine is a super interesting actor, and he's at a phase in his career where he's really willing and able to commit to um, just being like interesting and charismatic. He's not really being shoehorned into the sort of like stoic leading man roles that he was in Zeros. And as a result, he's making much more interesting choices. He's definitely on the same wavelength here as he was in Wonder Woman 1, especially,
Mm-hmm.
but with a bit more of a twinkle, like a bit more of a
Mm,
I'm clearly having the time of my life making this
yeah.
type twinkle in his eye.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not like it's his movie. Like it's very much an ensemble. This team of filmmakers really seems to know how to manage an ensemble, which I think is an underrated skill.
Mm-hmm.
because everyone, Michelle Rodriguez, Justice Smith, Sophia Lillis, Hugh Grant, and Regé-jean Page all get a moment to shine and a moment to be, um, to really sort of like, they all get a character arc. They all get a moment to shine. They all get super memorable moments, and none of them really overshadow the others. Chris Pine's character is ostensibly the protagonist, like he has the most clearly defined arc.
Mm-hmm.
But Michelle Rodriguez's character is along for that ride as well, and the Justice Smith and Sophia Lillis, they have their own separate arc that all gets resolved, tied up really nicely at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not wrong. I think honestly, my MVP here is Hugh Grant, who is also in a super interesting phase of his career where he's able to churn out. That's a negative way to say it, but he's able to do stuff like this. He's definitely working in the same wavelength as he was in Paddington 2, which, by the way, one of the best movies in the 21st century so far.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but he's also able to do things like he was in that HBO show recently with Nicole Kidman, which is just escaped my
Oh,
brain.
yeah.
um, in which he's also really, really good. Is what I'm trying to say. He's really showcasing his range and his just willingness to commit to the bit.
Mm,
And he's just so utterly charming, and he's able to really put a
mm,
layer of slime on that.
yeah.
That he could, he I think he understands that 20 or 30 years ago he would have been in Chris Pine's place, right? Like,
Yes.
or he,
Yeah.
or he,
Yeah.
or
For
he
sure.
could have been, because they do definitely all they operate in a similar, I'm gonna say wavelength again. I need to come up with a thesaurus here, but yeah, I mean it's just super fun. The movie is just super fun, and everyone in it is
I,
great. And the effects, there's only one or two moments of fairly dodgy CG, but they're not super dodgy. They're just like there's just a lot, and you can tell. But
yeah.
a lot of it's actually really well done. Like there's clearly a lot of care involved in setting up the effects, and
I want to.
the script is super sharp. Like there's lots of
Yeah.
there's one moment in particular where Michelle Rodriguez and Chris Pine are about to be executed, and the way they stall to get out of that is one of the funniest scenes I've seen all year. um, and you can find it. It's actually that scene is now floating around TikTok from the actual Dungeons and Dragons account, so
Mhm,
you can go find it if you really want to. But just watch the movie, man. Like
mhm.
such a good movie,
Yeah.
such a good time at the movies.
It's
Um,
really fun.
and it's I'm
Technically,
gonna say spoiler alert that this is easily one of my favorite films of the year so far.
yeah.
Um,
Technically as well, the way the story is told, I've gone on and on each week about I'm really invested in how stories are told now, the creativity in it. And the whole thing is creatively told brilliantly, but there's two sequences in this that absolutely blew me away. And the first is, if you've seen Game Night, you know it's quite famous for its one shot that it does in a mansion. And there's a one
mhm.
shot in this with a character, changed in character, basically escaping trouble by going through multiple iterations of what she could change into, and it's a one shot that like zooming through a castle that is mind blowing. It's just brilliant. And the second is a heist with a portal gun that is one of the best things I've seen in a movie in years, and it's so cleverly done. And when for me, I'm sure it's the same for you as well. The satisfaction of a sequence like that when it's so well done and it's so surprising just really drew me in more than I was already. It's technically brilliant.
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't think you were going to say the first one. I definitely knew you were going to say the second one though. And I think
Hmm.
one other thing that this movie really gets is the way they come across that portal gun is that it just turns out that one of them has it. Like I don't.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a spoiler, but I think the film very much understands that like not every bit of kit in their possession needs a
Yes.
huge
Totally.
explanation or backstory. It's just that one of the characters ends up with this thing, and with this portal gun basically, and then someone they don't know what it is, they just think it's a scepter, and then the character's like, that's a portal gun, and then they start using it. Like, and that
Yeah.
is actually kind of the way it's very similar to the way that Dungeons and Dragons just works. Or if you've ever played a
Yeah.
game based on Dungeons and
Totally.
Dragons, like you pick up loot and it turns out to be stuff. You know,
Yeah.
like sometimes it's just a stick, and sometimes it's a portal gun, and that's how the game
And
works. And I
the
think that's
idea
really
of a
clever.
the idea of a backpack of random stuff is a key point of D&D as well, and it's
Yeah.
really nice that that was captured too. We've got there's a board game called Adventure Begins, which is like a D&D intro for kids, and I play it with my kids all the time. And there's a few occasions where you have to get out your backpack and describe how you would kill this monster with all your random stuff, and it
Hmm.
really, really felt like that. It was just really fun.
Yeah. And I think also, I don't know if you noticed this, but anytime they're anywhere, they have, whenever they have something like in their hands, like most of the movie, Chris Pine's character has a lute because he's a bard. But then when he switches to a sword, um, the loot disappears and the sword is just in his hand. Like anything that goes into their bag just disappears, just like it does in
Yeah.
the game or in a video game. Like it just goes in the bag
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't seem to take up any physical space. And
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a really small detail, but like, and it could be just like, oh, well, they were just too lazy to put it in. But like, that's how the game works, man. That's how the game
Mm-hmm.
works.
Yeah.
And let me just say, I've already said that I think that Hugh Grant is probably the MVP, but I'm just going to walk that back slightly because I just want to talk about how wonderful Regé-jean is in this movie. He's
My
not
wife agrees.
he's not in it as much as you might expect. He's not part of the main party. He's definitely like an NPC in the game. Um, but he's so he's so wonderfully charismatic and so able to
Mm-hmm.
just deadpan the ridiculous shit his character has to say with such utter sincerity because he's like this he's a he's a paladin, he's a super um, honorable and straightforward person um, that helps them on one quest, and he's just so good again at this deadpan. Like there's a one point where there's a dragonborn, like a giant lizard creature, begging in the streets, and he gives this person a coin, and the monster says "Jankly," and he looks them dead in the eyes with all the sincerity and love in the world, and puts his hand on the monster's cheek and says "Jankly to you too, friend." And like, it's just like it's so ridiculous, but it's so well done. And
Mm-hmm.
let me just say here, if we're going to cast James Bond now, I think Regé-Jean Page is a good choice. So
Oh, you.
yeah. Anyway,
Yes. Yeah.
so just to sum up everything we've talked about, Dungeons and Dragons is fucking great, and I'm going to
Yeah.
go ahead and say that I think there is some clunkiness in the storytelling, but I'm going to say I've been going back and forth on this, but I'm going to say 4 stars. Out of
Well, I'm going to completely ignore any of that. This is a clear five for me. I think this kind of well written, well directed adventure ensemble is becoming increasingly rare with an
I mean, it
obsession
is.
to make everything dark. Like that obsession to make everything dark and gritty is completely doing my head in. And this is to see something that's just so to still have danger and stakes but still be light and fresh is incredibly hard to get right. And these were all the this is the movies I watched growing up with
Yeah.
all the
So
characters I watched growing up.
I will say that at the moment I've only seen it the one time, but
Hmm.
I did purchase it. I purchased it when it came
Hmm.
out on demand. It's out on Blu-ray at the end of the month.
Hmm.
Um, but I would be willing to bet real money that the second or third time I watch it, which will definitely
Hmm.
happen, it'll go up to five
Yeah,
stars, like 100%.
yeah.
You know, as I pick up on more nuance and I'm willing to forgive more of the stuff that I found a little clunky, or maybe I didn't get 100% the first time through.
Hmm.
Because this definitely belongs in the same canon as like movies I love and give 5 stars, like say The
Hmm.
Last Starfighter or Dragon Slayer
Oh yeah.
or any of those '80s sort of fantasy B movies, very particular.
Hmm.
This definitely belongs in that same company. And
Yeah.
there's a non-zero chance that this ends up on my best of the year.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's right at the top at the moment.
Yeah.
Yep, five stars all the way for me. I can't wait. I haven't bought it on demand because I want this on 4K, and so as soon as I have that, I will be watching this again for sure.
Yep. And I think they've already started talking about a sequel as well. So
Oh,
uh,
good.
I think
Excellent.
it's one of those things where as long as it makes enough money, which I think it should, uh,
Hmm.
then I think they're talking about a sequel, and I think they're also talking about a spin-off, like a I think they're trying to do the universe thing
Of course
as
they
well.
are.
But I think this could be something that Dungeons and Dragons is. I mean, it's already a universe. So I don't like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it.
Wonderful,
So let's
wonderful
move.
movie.
Let's move
Watch it.
on to another story of too much money in all the wrong places. Uh, and let's talk about our second film, which is the upcoming release. So we're recording this and releasing it on the 7th of May. This movie hits theaters this coming Friday from Elevation Pictures here in Canada, and that is the Canadian tech biopic BlackBerry, um, which, in case you've been living under a rock, is the story of the BlackBerry, the initial sort of smartphone, which was a Canadian development. And I'm happy to say that this is actually not an American film. This is actually a Canadian made and
Hmm.
produced and starring film. There's one sort of big American actor in it, but it is a very much a Canadian film.
Hmm.
Um, and it basically chronicles the story of the BlackBerry, of Research in Motion, the company that made the BlackBerry, from about 1996 when they introduced the product to 2008 when the iPhone effectively obliterated them. And I don't think that's a spoiler to say because the iPhone effectively obliterated most smartphones on the market at the time.
Hmm.
And it features two, I would say, very great performances. One from Jay Baruchel. Uh, Apologies, I'm not sure if it's Baruchel or Baruchel. But anyway, he plays Mike Lazaridis, who's the engineer who came up with the BlackBerry along with his team. He's the guy who figured out the way to get data onto a smartphone before anyone else. Super smart guy. And then there's Glenn Howerton, probably most famous for It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and AP Bio is here as Jim Balsley, who is the sort of business shark who became co-CEO of RIM, Research in Motion, and helped get BlackBerry off the ground. It's not hyperbole to say that BlackBerry was one of the biggest tech firms in the world, certainly one of the biggest ones in Canadian history, a huge deal. So their rise and fall is, I think, an important story. And this film has the potential to just fairly dry, but it's not. And the reason for that is that Glenn Howerton and Jay Baruchel are so good in it.
Hmm.
Um, they are they are both. I mean, it's hard. You can't ever really say that Jay Baruchel is ever unrecognizable. His voice is too distinct for that.
Hmm.
Um, but they are both basically unrecognizably good in this,
Hmm.
and I like them both as performers anyway. But they're both so like fully committed to the performance um, that I think if it wasn't them, the film would be lesser, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, the basic story is that BlackBerry is the company Research in Motion is not doing especially well in 1996, and they make a deal with Jim Balsley to come on and give them some financing and some business direction. And eventually, they create the BlackBerry and sell it to Verizon. And then the film is a couple of time jumps, but it basically chronicles their story from like nothing to the acme of tech, and then the beginnings of their fall from grace. Um, all of this is public record, so I don't want to spoil it, but um, they
Yeah,
both
I don't.
have great character arcs, and if you were alive or have read Wikipedia, you sort of know how this is going to end when I say it ends in 2008. But Jay Baruchel in particular is so good as Lazaridis, starting out as this very sort of like meek um, engineer who doesn't really know how to deal with people, who by the end has become this almost the shark that Bosley is from the start of a CEO. And his
Mm.
his arc, it sounds pretty simple, but his arc is much more nuanced than that. And does a really good job of conveying everything that Lazaridis did in time frame. I don't know. What did
Mm.
you? So I think this movie's really good. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And it's in particular, I think it's really well performed, and
Hmm.
it's also super nice that it is because it's a Canadian production. Yet you already have Jay Baruchel, but you also have Michael Ironside, and you have Saul Rubinek, and a number of other fairly big deal Canadian actors who show up and tell this Canadian story, which just makes me happy on a national level, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like I
So
always like when these stories are made by us and not by America.
I'm
You
sorry,
know?
Michael Ironside is Canadian.
Yeah.
I
Did you not?
did not know that.
Did you
Did
know
not
that?
know that.
Oh yeah. No, he's
I did
Canadian.
not. I did not. All these years.
Yeah, he's born in Toronto, or if you're from
Oh,
Toronto, or if you're from there,
Toronto.
Toronto.
But Michael Ironside is characterized by being a badass, like a snappy, grumpy, like military style badass. That's not Canadian at all. He's
I
not
mean,
polite in any of his movies.
we definitely have those people. I
So,
mean, Ironside really got his start working with David Cronenberg, who's also Canadian. He's the
yes,
antagonist in Scanners,
yeah.
Visiting Hours. He was in that show B, and then obviously Top Gun in '86. But yeah,
Hmm.
he's a Canadian actor. He shows up. He actually
Well,
shows up in a lot of Canadian work too. Like
he's
he's been
great.
in several like small budget Canadian things that I've seen over the last few years. Because again, he just seems to be a guy who likes to work, and if he can work close to home, I think he'll do it. So it's a good thing.
Yeah,
Um,
good for him being getting to the position where he's still alive and probably making so much money off his 80s and 90s output that he can just make whatever he wants now. That's great.
yeah,
And so I'm really interested in this film, especially as we watched it quite quick on the heels of Tetris, and it really exemplifies everything I was saying about Tetris, and that I thought Tetris was incredibly bland and didn't really use the Tetris model to for the storytelling when it could have. And I think BlackBerry's the other side of that coin, and I'm just absolutely fascinated in how this movie is shot and presented in that it feels like it's filmed on very low grade quality like VHS film cameras from the 90s, many of which I used in my own filmmaking training. And there's the it feels very documentary style. But what I find fascinating as well, and I don't really know how to say this without sounding like an insult, but there's something about Jay Baruchel's like white wig and Matthew Johnson's like headband, his Bjorn Borg headband and long hair, and Glenn Howerton's um,
bald hairdo.
well, like whoever did Glenn Howerton's head has never seen like what actual Mel Patton Balding looks like. It's like a monk. He's like shaved a monk's top out of Glenn Howerton's full rich head of hair. And there's something weird because it almost felt like a Beastie Boys music video. You know, when they went through an era of making like 80s and 90s cop style New York videos. It kind of feels like that with a handheld camera and low stock and pretty pretty basic costumes, but this it really worked for this. I was really
Hmm.
fascinated by it. I thought Jay Baruchel, this is the performance of his career so far. I've never seen him this nuanced at all because he has made his fame as kind of being the comedic, quippy actor, and I thought he was so controlled in this. I've only ever seen Glenn Howerton in Always Sunny, so to see him absolutely just tearing up the screen and being
Yeah.
genuinely scary and intimidating, I thought he was amazing. And really, this extends to all of the supporting cast as well. And I love the interplay. It's really well written as well, and I love the interplay between Glenn Howerton and Jay Baruchel as Jim and Mike, especially when Jim starts realizing that Mike is not this useless introvert, like tech introvert. When he gets him into the sales pitch, one of their first big sales pitches with oh, I can't remember the first big
It's
company they go to.
it's
Big insurance company.
Verizon, and the CEO of Verizon is played by Saul Rubinek.
Right, that's right. And
Yeah.
there's a wonderful scene where Glenn Howerton's the shark, and he goes in and is like, this is gonna change the world. You're not selling products, you're selling minutes." And it's just the
Yeah,
most like
you're selling
smarmy,
self reliance. That's what you're selling.
right.
Like
And it's
yeah,
so
big corporate pitch
smarmy.
territory.
And that's right, and he does it so well. And then he's been that shark up to that point, and then Saul Rubinek's character John Woodman's like, you're not a techie, you have no clear. We've tried this, it doesn't work. And then Mike comes in as the tech. Joe Barrichello finds his footing as, like with every classic introvert, you give them the thing they want to talk about, and they will talk about it forever. And this is like,
Yeah,
oh, this is I can talk about this stuff. And I thought it was really, really well balanced and written, and but mainly performed. And I loved the style of it. I thought the handheld camera, the low grade stock, the almost janky costumes just really fit everything that
yeah,
the movie was trying to tell anyway. And it's just the perfect example for me of creatively telling a story in a style that fits the story, as opposed to Tetris's really bland and hugely missed opportunities to do the same. I was really surprised at this because I'm not a big fan of, like, this is how the product was made. I don't think we should revere capitalist CEOs and how they made their money, but this was a genuinely interesting story, written and directed and performed brilliantly. Really, really blown away by this film.
yeah. And I do think it's another case where I wouldn't go so far as to say that this film is a full blown comedy. Like it's definitely
Yeah.
advertised that it is, and it definitely has a lot of like laugh out loud moments. But I think this is a really smart example of casting primarily comedic actors because basically everyone who's in it, Gabriel Kell, Glenn Howerton, Rich Sumner, and Sung Wong Cho show up in it as well. These are all people who are very, very funny, and we all know Carrie Elwes can be very, very funny as well. Um, but I think it's a really great example of casting people who have amazing comedic sensibilities in mostly dramatic roles. It's like that. My favorite quote about filmmaking in the recent last like years from Jordan Peele, where he says, "The difference between horror and comedy is the music." And I feel like this
Yeah,
film
yeah,
really understands
yeah.
that. Like I think that this film really understands that the type of dialogue that they're having, which again is funny, but it needs to
Mhm,
be delivered in such a way that it feels very natural and dramatic, and they carry off this balance incredibly well. And
mhm,
I think for me, the CEO is or the CEO, the MVP is probably Glenn Howerton, but they're both
mhm.
so good. Like him and Bershman are
Yeah,
so good. But
it's a
it's an
balance, isn't it?
interesting it's an interesting it's an interesting thing to watch him play, who is a character who is in many ways Dennis from It's Always Sunny, but if Dennis were competent.
Yes, totally.
If you know what I mean, like
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
um and I think like I say the story's out there, like you can find it. It's all public record. So I will say
Mhm,
that I do think the back half of the film loses a bit of steam, but there's no other way to tell the story. That's pretty much what happened.
mhm,
That the company sort of lost sight of itself, and
mhm,
I do think the front half is a little more intense and interesting than the back half, but the whole thing is great.
mhm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's
and it's easily I would have to go back and check, but it's easily I think the best Canadian film I've seen, and I fully
mhm,
expect it to be a front runner at the CSAs next year.
mhm.
In the same way that Brother was this year.
Yeah.
It's
No,
a
absolutely.
totally different film, but like I fully expect
Yeah,
this to be one that we see a lot of at the CSAs next
yeah.
year. Yeah, it's a good movie.
Sorry,
It's
yeah, I was
it's
thinking
sort of
about
spaced
how
out
good
there.
it was. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
just thinking about all the parts of it I really liked, and I was just genuinely surprised by it. And
and it makes me want to
I,
seek out. It makes me want to seek out more of Matt Johnson's stuff because I know that I've seen some of Nirvana the band show, which he made. But I don't think I've seen Operation Avalanche or the Dirties. I've seen the Dirties. I can't remember.
I
Um,
haven't even heard of these.
but yeah, yeah, he made a couple of films. He's made a couple of films, and they're all good. And I think
Hmm.
I always am a little bit dubious when a director puts themselves in a movie, but I think as putting himself in this position as a supporting player, um, and sort of the like antithesis to what the Jim character becomes through the movie, I think is a
Hmm.
really interesting choice. And
Hmm.
just to highlight again, I also really like Saul Rubinek as a performer. I always enjoy him when he shows up and stuff, even if that thing
Hmm.
that he's in happens to be bad. Um,
Hmm.
but I think this film, that scene you're talking about, where they're giving their pitch to Verizon, and Jim comes in and basically outlines how they can make this tech work. There's a He gives a wonderful, almost wordless performance as a tech guy, realizing that what
Hmm.
Jim is saying makes sense
Hmm.
and realizing the potential. And it's all done through like body language and facial expression. And it's such a
Hmm.
wonderful scene, like such a wonderful
Hmm.
scene. And I've actually legitimately thought that like should make a one day when I have time, I'm going to make a podcast that just follows Saul Rubinek's career, like from beginning to end, because I think he's such an interesting Canadian performer. Um,
Huh.
but
Mm.
yeah, so anyway, this movie is really well written, again by Matt Johnson, as well as directed, um,
Yeah.
and really well written, really well performed, and I hope it makes a ton of money. I hope it makes a ton of money.
I hope so. It's extra fascinating to someone, to people our age as well, who were using this technology. I always felt that when BlackBerry failed, I was genuinely shocked because they always felt like such a standard, unbreakable part of that tech. Like they were used
Hmm.
so much by so many companies,
Yep.
and I always find it a little humbling when like one day that's going to happen. One day Disney's going to close. Like one day
Yeah.
Marvel's going to close, and I always find it absolutely fascinating. Like how do you go from world market leader to nothing? And it turns out in this case it was like we've seen him in parallel things not reacting quickly enough to something else that's the new leader, and
Yeah. Certainly not. I mean,
it's
when
just so interesting.
it's interesting watching this film as someone who's in their 40s because I remember watching. There's a very pivotal scene in the movie in the back half where Jim is called away from a business meeting because Steve Jobs is introducing the iPhone, and I remember that speech. I remember that presentation,
Hmm.
and I remember how electric it was to watch that and realize what Apple was about. Like when they were building to it, you're like, "Holy shit, he's gonna smart! They're making
Hmm.
this like whatever they're about to do is going to change the way we do things." And it's it's not a mistake. It's not a coincidence that before 2007, every smartphone looked like a BlackBerry, and after 2007,
Yeah,
every smartphone
yes.
looks like an iPhone.
But because
You
of that,
know?
when the iPhone got announced, and I remember that too, and I was using a BlackBerry at that time. I'm sure I was, and I thought, wow, how is anyone going to want to go from physical keyboard to on-screen keys? There's no way an on-screen keyboard is going to work. No
Yeah,
one's going to go for that, and well, that's why I don't work in tech. But just that moment, that like absolute disrupting moment of tech is always really interesting to me.
yeah, and again, not really a spoiler because it's all public record, but like the way that they, because again, at this point, Jim and Mike are both. I think I've been transposing their name. Jim and Mike are both. Um,
Mm,
they're both not reacting to what's happening correctly for different reasons, and I think it's really interesting to watch the performances of them doing that and then talking to one another and still not really getting it. I think it's a really interesting
mhm,
watch. And I would honestly love to see even just a short film centered around Steve Ballmer at Microsoft at the same time. Famously gave an interview where
mhm.
he's like, "No keyboard. They're not just going to walk in and conquer the market." Talking about the iPhone. I would I would love to see a short film or a feature length film of like the discussions of at Microsoft at the same time. It'd be super
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
But anyway,
Oh well.
uh,
I mean,
so BlackBerry,
whenever they decide to make the blockbuster story, they've got the whole structure ready to go, haven't they?
they really do, yeah.
Become world leader and then not react quickly enough. So how many stars are you giving BlackBerry?
This one's 4 stars for me as well.
Yeah, it's
It's
four.
it's
This
it's
one's
a
four.
super good. Um, I do think, like I said, it does lose a bit of steam in the back half. And
Hmm.
for me, again, as someone who already knew the story, I thought it was really well performed. But I already kind of the story, so there
Hmm.
wasn't. And to be clear, like at the time this was happening, I was very invested in tech. I even had at one point a tech blog, which doesn't exist anymore, so don't ask me about it.
Did you? I didn't know
Um,
that.
it was before we met, and And so like I'm a little closer to it than I think most people are. So I think that there's going to be a lot of twists and turns and surprises for most audiences. Um, and I think it's great. I think it's a great film. I think it's easily the best Canadian film of the year. It's one of the best Canadian films I would say I've seen in the last few years, and we've seen a lot of great Canadian films in the last few years. I've made sure of that for this podcast. But it's easily. Well, I think it's probably going to end up on my best of the year list too. It's maybe it's a bit early to say that in May, but I think it'll probably end up.
Hmm.
At this
Yeah,
point,
it's a thought. It's a
at this
thought for
point
me
it's
as
very
well.
firmly on my best of the year list so far. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's great. I really hope that it makes a ton of money. It is being released in theaters on the 12th of May by Elevation
Hmm.
Pictures, at least here in Canada, and I'm sure in the United States. Well, not
Hmm.
not sure who has it in the state, but it is definitely got.
You should go see it. I think this will play really well in a theater with a group of people. I think it's there's definitely, you're right. It's not a comedy, but there are funny moments, and it's very snappy, and I think it will play really well. You should go see it.
Yeah, agreed. And if nothing else, like you're going to spend 2 hours with two actors giving two great performances, so
Hmm.
like
Yeah, yeah,
that's never a
definitely worth
loss.
it. Hmm.
Yeah,
Good.
good.
Well, excellent. I want to know what your tech blog was called and what your AOL keyword was to find your tech blog. Was it called like Matt's Tech Wonderland, Alta Vista?
No,
What was the name of your tech blog, or is that a secret?
it doesn't exist anymore. But it was me and my friend who now owns and operates the company makes Geekbench,
Oh, John.
which is a very popular benchmarking tool, and it was called Geek.
Geek Patrol.
Yeah,
Lovely. Well, good. What have we got coming up for the next week? What are you looking
I
forward to?
I I don't know why you asked me this question. I have so much stuff, and I don't know what we're
Yeah,
going to be covering next week.
yeah.
But I will have a couple of pieces going up. I just wrote a review of Star Wars Visions for that shelf, and I will have a review
Ooh.
soon up for the Big Door Prize for that shelf. And I will also have. I also just had a review go up on exclaim.ca for Polite Society, which you should also definitely see. It's great.
Mm, I want to
And
see that.
I will have a review up on this coming week, also on Exclaim, for a new Disney, or sorry, FX show called The Class of '09. Um, hopefully that'll be up tomorrow or the next day. Uh, but yeah, I don't honestly. We just there's so much to watch. We have to figure out what we're gonna watch for the podcast. It's interesting because most of my movie watching is now for the podcasting, but my writing career has shifted very
Mhm.
much to TV. So
Oh, that's good. You love
yeah,
TV. That's
I
perfect.
do watch a lot of TV, probably too much. Anyway,
Good. Well, thank you for listening.
yeah, thank you for listening. We have a number of new subscribers again this week, so everyone who's new here, welcome. We're glad to have you. Everyone who's been around for a while, welcome back. We're glad to have you too. Um, we're just happy you're all here. If you have liked the show and you would like to support us more directly, thank you to everyone who's already subscribing. But if you aren't, hit that subscribe button on whatever your podcasting platform of choice. We are on most of them, and if you would like to leave us a star rating, review, or both, that would be infinitely helpful. Those things help us show up in charts and all kinds of places that we wouldn't normally. And if you would like to support us a little more directly, we do, of course, have our Patreon feed. You can find that in the show notes, and all patrons of the podcast get a bonus conversation. This week's was about 15 minutes, mostly about Robert Zemeckis um, as well. So if you like hearing us talk, you get to hear more of us talk. So I think that works out, don't you? If you'd like to find us on the socials, you can do so. The show is at Awesome Friday CA on most major platforms. I am at Matthew AF. Simon is at Temporary Pen. Um, so follow us in places. That's
Mm.
Instagram and Twitter for me, and Twitter for him, and Twitter and Instagram for the show. What am I forgetting? Nope, that's
When do
about
we
it.
record?
We record this here in Vancouver on the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. So one more time, thank you so much for listening and for joining us here on this awesome Friday.
Bye bye.